Hello and welcome to the Make It Conscious podcast. This is episode 7 and today's topic is mind control, understanding the techniques of psychological manipulators. Following on from last week's episode where we talked about narcissism and the week before that where I talked about exploitative cults and group situations. Today we're going to be teasing apart the actual techniques that these people and organizations use to control people psychologically, also through force. But really, the most insidious form of control is that which looks like freedom, right? So as much as we have this sense of being free, truthfully, freedom only stretches as far as the limits of our consciousness, to quote Carl Jung. And therefore, where we're making decisions unconsciously through the unconscious mind, psychological control techniques can be used very effectively. So mind control is very much a real thing. And so in a similar way to the previous episodes where we looked at the principles of narcissism and cults and what they look like, again today we're going to be teasing apart the techniques of mind control. We're going to be using a model by Hassan as part of that called the BITE model. And we're going to be understanding, yes, what it looks like, what to look out for, but also understanding some of the principles and mechanisms that are going on behind the scenes here when it comes to mind control. So as I said, the title of this episode is Mind Control, Techniques of Psychological Manipulators. I think it's worth reiterating something that I touched on in the last episode here. It's quite common that a person doesn't want to believe in mind control, manipulation, evil, believing that people are essentially good. Now, on some level, that may be true, right? But there's a lot of nuance we need to tease apart here. The point, though, is that through our unwillingness to be seen as judgmental, we don't want to judge, we want to be kind to everybody, right? We can actually leave ourselves exposed and not see things as they really are, with the shadow, darker sides of people's character alongside the good, right? Because everyone has good and everyone has darkness and shadow as well. So we really want to be finding the middle as we navigate our own daily lives, but also as we grow spiritually. An essential part of that is to be able to find this middle between being judgmental at one extreme and being completely undiscerning at the other extreme. And there are many people in this world who aren't willing to do that, who aren't willing to make the unconscious conscious, and in perpetually trying to keep that natural process at bay, they have to do all kinds of things that look like spiritual growth, right? They have to wear the right clothes, they have to say the right things, and they have to sort of try and gain this attention and validation, otherwise known as narcissistic supply. But really under the hood, are they actually making the unconscious conscious? Or are they actually manipulating people through their unconscious minds as a way to not have to go there themselves? So it's really important that we are able to see things clearly and walk that line between those two extremes, like neither walking foolishly into every situation where people might not have the best intentions for us, but likewise not judging, pushing people away and seeing them as all bad and permanently that way, and at the same time shutting down any capacity for healthy, wholesome, productive relationships with anybody, right? Not least this person who we may have judged unfairly. So it's a difficult line to walk, but that's the skill here, right? If it was easy, what would life be, right? If there was just a one-size-fits-all answer, it wouldn't be much of a journey. But I want to kick things off here with quite an important point that I feel encapsulates a lot of what I'd like to get across in today's session. And it is that if ever a person tries to persuade another to think, say, or do something in a way that they wouldn't if they had empathy, then that is unethical. So this is a really helpful little tip to bear in mind if trying to understand whether what someone is doing is ethical or not. And it comes down to empathy. I discussed empathy a few episodes ago in detail and discussed how I think about empathy from a psycho-spiritual perspective. And I define that as the willingness to be transformed by our experience. So if anyone's ever trying to get us to think, say, or do something in a way that they wouldn't if they were willing to be transformed themselves, then they're not acting in our best interests. And it's necessary for our own growth that we integrate the thing that we are resisting in that situation, what we're encountering. If they're not coming from a perspective of, okay, how can I also do the same in this situation? Then they are necessarily only pushing something away in themselves. And so they are by default not engaging with you as another human being. They see you as a tool to be used to further bolster their own self-image and resistance to true change. So a lot of times people and organizations and even governments will employ forms of undue influence and psychological control, but they'll have to placate their conflict by making out that it is somehow in your benefit, that's good for you, and so on. But really, if they're not doing it as a way to reach mutual transformation, then they are necessarily doing it to transform you to their ends. And this is something that happens in our world and actually maybe serves a necessary purpose, because it actually compels those who are interested in true growth, genuine spirituality, to actually transform. It creates challenges that reflect aspects of ourselves that we haven't yet integrated. So, in summary, empathy is never unethical, and a lack of empathy is never ethical. Right? Pretty clear cut, I hope. So, mind control is real. Intuitively, if we're not familiar with this stuff, we might think that actually, well, how can mind control be real? I mean, I feel like I'm making my own decisions. I feel like I'm free. Surely everything that people do is just their own decisions, right? And no one's forcing them to buy unhealthy food, right? Or take drugs, or engage in promiscuity, or spend their money on frivolous things, or buy digital courses that end up to be bunk. They're doing that all of their own free will, right? Again, some nuances required here. Here's the thing. Mind control works, and it works by leveraging the fears and desires of the unconscious mind. So the aspects of ourselves that we aren't conscious of, it's full of its own potential energy and potential emotions. And you can think of it as like a separate personality that's just not conscious. It's not the most accurate description, but it's kind of like a workable way of thinking about it. So there are essentially like these fears and desires that kind of, for want of a better word, do exist in the unconscious mind. And it's like they have a personality of their own and will act out the motivations of that personality until they are made conscious and straightened out in the conscious mind. And we don't choose, by and large, what is in the unconscious mind. At some point along the line, we can repress things, and we can do that consciously and push things away because they're too painful. But much of what's in there is completely not our choice. It's not the ego's choice. A lot of it's collective. A lot of it was formed in the first few years of life. So we don't really decide what's in there. But we can take responsibility for it when it arises. In fact, that's kind of all we can do. That's a very powerful thing. That is the basis of our life's journey, is really taking responsibility for what comes up and dealing with it in a skillful way. Like, from one perspective, you can construe the journey of life as primarily consisting of that process. So what is evil then? Well, evil occurs when an individual becomes attached to something, right? And so they then start to confuse whatever that thing is, whether it's money, power, narcissistic supply, drugs, could be anything, any object of attachment. And it starts to confuse what that thing represents for the realness within them. So in the case of, say, narcissists or any psychological manipulator who is hungry for attention and validation, what they really need is love and connection, right? And they've shut down any possibility of that happening, most likely. And this has roots in their childhood And you can look at the last episode for a full discussion on that. But essentially what's going on here is the ego is confusing what looks like love and connection for the real thing. Because they've completely shut down to any connection, any empathy, any ability to transform, because transformation would mean opening the floodgates to that mass of unresolved feeling that's just trying to break through, that has to break through at some point. It's inexorable. But the ego has decided in this lifetime, that's not going to happen, that can't happen. So I'm just going to put up defenses against it, project, defend, deny, accuse, spin things around. And that's how evil comes about, because then they obsess with that unilateral image of what they really need, and everything else gets thrown out the way. It means walking over people, it means hurting people emotionally, physically, financially, legally, spiritually. But as far as ego is concerned, they're getting what they need. And so they have to construct all kinds of narratives to justify and rationalize that behavior. But we're free to do that, okay? Because at the heart of our being is freedom. So as inevitable as these unresolved feelings are, we're free to delay our coming to terms with them for as long as we like. They're going to have to rear their head eventually, and the world will move and shift in a way that puts the ego face to face with those feelings ultimately. But we can push them away if we like. And in the grand scheme of things, I'm not saying there's anything bad or wrong about that. I think as soon as you start thinking in terms of bad and wrong, you're kind of looking at a mere slice of true reality, right? And in the grand scheme of things, everything comes good in the end. So, you have those that are, in short, taking responsibility for their mind, and you have those that aren't taking responsibility for their mind. And you might subdivide that further group into those who aren't taking responsibility but pretending to be, and those that aren't pretending to be. But the really dangerous manipulators almost invariably pretend that they are taking responsibility for their mind. It's the perfect cover for not actually doing it. So these two sides of that coin, they kind of serve each other in a way. Evil compels the sage to keep developing and reflects things that they haven't yet made conscious. And the sage is quite inspiring to evil because it has something that they don't have. And so the true self within the manipulators finds the sage very compelling because it knows that they can get close to what they really need through that person. But the ego will most likely put up defenses to that relationship ultimately. And one way or another end up pushing that person away. So I just touched on this. The truth is that true reality is more wonderful than any positive thinking or denial of evil could ever arrive at. If we have to deny the existence of evil in the way I've just described it, or adopt positive thinking, then I'd make the case that we're in a pretty dismal state because true reality is just perfect. But arriving at this understanding entails facing the darkness in ourselves and seeing the necessity of the existence of evil. As long as we have critical components of our own personality that we need to integrate, evil will exist. And so on some level we create it, but the more we make it conscious in ourselves, the less we'll find it appears out there in the world. So in my own spiritual practice, I've developed a series of 7 habits, which I call the 7 habits of individuation. And this is the product of many interactions over the last 20 years with many people I know, psychologists, coaches, and spiritual leaders of various traditions who all have their own way of doing things, all have something to say. And I discussed a lot of these in the first few episodes of this series. So episodes 1, 2, and 3, I talk more about what spirituality is and what the path to spirituality is and how it involves the unconscious and conscious minds. But importantly, the first habit in this series is to take responsibility for your mind. And so as we go into this discussion about mind control, we want to bear this in mind because it's really not about pointing the finger and saying, you know what, if only we just lined up all the manipulators and shot them, wouldn't life be better? Well, no, because you're then becoming the perpetrator, and you're actually pushing away something in your own mind. In doing that, you're not making the unconscious conscious. So that's why any attempt at genetic sort of manipulation of humans or purity or anything like this is and always has been doomed to failure, because all it's doing is pushing away shadow elements of one's own mind, only for them to inevitably appear in the real world in the future, right? So the only real solution to all of this ultimately is to take responsibility for your own mind, including the unconscious mind. So it's important to understand the signs of mind control, know what it looks like, understand the principles, but all the while bearing this in mind, this is not about pointing the finger as much as we can understand the evil that's being employed in these dynamics. We still have to take responsibility for our own mind. It doesn't mean we are causing it. It's not like saying, you have a bad ego or anything like that, but it's about understanding that we can take responsibility for what arises, and that is the ultimate way out. As Carl Jung said, I can only say that as far as consciousness reaches, the will is understood to be free, i.e., that the feeling of freedom accompanies your decisions, no matter if they are truly free or not. So the more we make conscious, the more free we will truly be. Our lack of freedom, to whatever extent it is a lack, exists as a function of what is unseen in our own mind. And I think until you've really done, say, a lot of inquiry into the nature of mind, it's not necessarily intuitive that there is such a thing as the unconscious. And maybe we have to go through a few iterations of being blindsided by our unconscious before we really start to get a feel for the prominence of its influence on our lives. In fact, it's, for most people, I believe, driving most of their decisions most of the time. Another important takeaway from this quote is that we feel free often, even when we're not. So even when we are being strung along by our unconscious fears and desires, the conscious ego is feeding us an experience that makes it feel like we are the one making these decisions. And of course, those who are manipulating, those who have set their stall out to not grow and transform, to feed themselves and others a story and manipulate others as a way to uphold that story, the idea that we are completely freely acting beings all the time, that's a wonderful narrative to those people, right? They want you to think that you are deciding everything. Now, it really depends what we mean by you and what we mean by deciding, right? I mean, there's nuance here, and a lack of nuance is a pretty common feature of people of this mindset, right? If by you we mean the self, the entire psyche, including the unconscious, sure. And if we by decide we mean is moving us in certain directions, although not consciously deciding, then sure, yeah, we do on some level bring these things about. But that's not a mistake, and that's not something to look at ourselves, our self-image and the ego, and blame it and say, you've done something bad or wrong. This is a perfectly natural feature of mind. It's a necessary feature of mind in order for us to grow, encounter ourselves in life. So mind control works by meeting unconscious needs in the individual. The unconscious mind is the channel for which psychological manipulators both exert control and avoid detection. If seeing the abuse that's being employed here would render our own unresolved feelings to come to the surface, feelings that we would rather push away, then we're not going to be willing to see what's going on, most likely. So if we're not willing to see the deception that's being employed, then the deception campaign doesn't really need to be very sophisticated. Our mind will latch on to any narrative that just resolves that conflict for us temporarily. So when unconscious needs are being met, decisions are also being made unconsciously. Red flags will go unnoticed as the mind filters them out. Or if they do enter consciousness, they will be rendered in such a way that they seem to be supportive of the abuse. So this is quite common in narcissistic dynamics, so where there's an abuser and a victim, and the victim who doesn't really want to see the abuser as they really are will see the red flags as somehow supportive of what's going on. And most likely the abuser is actually supporting that rationalization. They're actually maybe even feeding them the story that their mind willingly takes on of, oh, well, it was only for my own good, for example. Like, he only did it because he loved me, right? This kind of thing. And the victim is then, because they don't want to see what's really going on, because it would just be such a painful projection withdrawal, right? They've idealized this person. They've projected maybe their animus or anima onto the other person, or even the sage or the father or the mother. And to cease engaging with that archetype is a very painful thing to go through. It's a necessary thing to withdraw the projection at some point so that you can integrate it into yourself. But the process of doing that is very painful, and the ego typically doesn't want to go there. So the persona shadow dynamic that exists in ourselves creates the situations that put us face to face with the repressed parts of ourselves. I talked about the persona shadow dynamic in the previous episode, and this is really about how we come to identify at a young age. That's the persona, and the shadow is the opposite of that. That was said, the shadow is like a realm of traits and qualities that we've pushed away, that we don't want to be seen as, because they've been locked in by unresolved feeling. And so when we start to experience the shadow, either in other people or in ourselves, those feelings start to rear their head, and the ego likes to push that away. But because there's a kind of energetic polarity here, like there's an unresolved feeling, the world will find a way to create situations that put us face to face with the shadow, and it's trying to like find a way to get us to resolve that feeling. And so if we find ourselves encountering this kind of behavior in the world of people trying to control us in various ways, then it's because on some level there's something in our mind that needs to be integrated. There's something probably in the shadow that we need to bring on board in order to really skillfully handle this situation. And this is not to negate the evil that's occurring, the manipulation, the lack of empathy, but it is about taking responsibility for our own mind and therefore actually resolving it going forward. And it comes down to what we make conscious then in ourselves. But crucially here, without an unconscious, mind control would not be possible. It simply would not be possible. It is only through the unconscious mind that mind control can be exerted. Let's get now into the core of this presentation. We're going to talk about Stephen Hassan's bite model. Now, Stephen Hassan is probably the, in fact, leading expert on cults and techniques of undue influence. So his work has been very helpful for me. A couple of years ago, I read his book, Combating Cult Mind Control, and it really helped me make sense of a lot of the stuff that I experienced in the cult. And so he has developed this model called the bite model, and it describes the methods used to create control and codependency by cults, yes, but also by narcissists on a sort of smaller scale, one-on-one or in families, organizations, so whether it's a team, whether it's a malignant boss, or even organizational-wide control, and even governments. And you see, this whole model was based on earlier research by a guy called Robert J. Lifton, who studied the brainwashing techniques used in Maoist China, as well as the cognitive dissonance theory by Leon Festinger. So this is, tried, tested, understood. This stuff is real. It works. It happens. And, we're going to learn really what it's about here so we can actually learn to protect ourselves from it and see it when it's arising. BITE is an acronym. It stands for behavior, information, thoughts, and emotions. So these are the four broad areas of control techniques employed by psychological abusers at all levels. Again, whether it's individuals, organizations, or governments. So a quote from Stephen Hassan here, he says, "Destructive mind control can be determined when the overall effect of these four components promotes dependency and obedience to some leader or cause. It is not necessary for every single item on the list to be present." Now, it's unfortunate that Stephen would even have to say that it's not necessary for every single item on the list to be present, but this is a common pushback from many manipulators. Well, I don't force anyone. oh, well, they're free to leave at any time. Yeah, but there's countless kinds of undue influence. It doesn't take, genius level logic to understand that just because you don't do X, Y, Z kind of control, that you therefore can't do all the others as well. So unfortunately, it does have to be pointed out. But, different people will employ a different pattern of control. Some will be very focused on behavior, some very focused on emotional control, right? The split can be widely varied. But in Stephen Hassan's view, it would be considered destructive mind control when overall it promotes dependency and obedience to some leader or cause. Or I would add, any individual, right? It doesn't necessarily have to be a leader. It can be your partner or a parent or whoever, a colleague at work. And this also relates to what I said at the very start, where if there's any attempt to influence that wouldn't be occurring if there was empathy, then that's by default pointing to a lack of ethical integrity. So now let's look at the model in a bit more detail. So behavioural control, as it sounds, is any attempt to regulate your behaviour, or more broadly, your physical reality. So behavioural control can be any attempt to control your physical location, the kind of work you do, who you associate with, who you hang out with, whether you're in touch with your family or not, where you live, the kinds of foods that you eat, and also, of course, placing inordinate demands on your time, right? As though their needs are of utmost importance and your needs aren't important, or that you are benefited by having the honour of helping this person in this exalted cause. And of course, all of this does encourage dependency and obedience. It actually ties in with emotional control because there's likely to be a kind of carrot and stick approach to encouraging, the right behaviour, although it may not even be deemed as right or correct, but actually the message is still clear that, you want to eat the right foods, you shouldn't be drinking coffee, and, you shouldn't be living with your family anymore, or whatever it is. You shouldn't be with that woman, you should leave her. And even though it might not be stated explicitly, it doesn't actually matter. If anything, it's just more insidious if it's not stated explicitly, because the overall result is that this person then feels like they have to do these things in order to not come to harm in some way. Behavioural control can include sabotaging plans that you have if they're not in the abuser's interests, or encouraging separation between you and loved ones. It can be very extreme. It can be physical violence, rape, or imprisonment, and sleep deprivation. These are all techniques used by abusers and cults, right? Some of the more extreme cults still do these things. Clothing and physical appearance, this is a big one. So this can include hairstyles, right? This can include piercings, tattoos of certain kinds. In the cult of Nexium, this involved branding. So this is quite horrific, right? Way of controlling behavior and giving women the mark of the cult. Behavioral control can include how we speak. And in this series, I've differentiated between, what I call kind speech and being nicey-nicey, right? They're two very different things. And what a manipulator will sometimes do is, if they deem that you're not being nicey-nicey, given the lack of nuance, right, in service of their fantasy, it's like, well, you're not being kind. And actually, sometimes kind speech and nice speech are two very different things. One makes the unconscious conscious in both parties and is nonetheless harmless, but the other one is just trying to create an image and push feelings away. And lastly, of course, practices and rituals. Now, many of the things that cults practice can be very beneficial. Meditation is something I'm certainly a proponent of. I include that in the 7 Habits of Individuation, this daily practice of training the mind. But it can also be used in a certain context in a certain way that is actually to test compliance and encourage obedience. So these are all ways that a person's mind can be controlled, and a manipulator has to work with the kind of mind that is unconsciously willing to be involved in it. But as you'll know if you've been through something like this, that actually the whole time they're trying to make it seem like something else is going on, and that actually this is actually a really important mission we're all working on here, and actually I do have your best interests at heart. And of course that's all just a guise for what the real mission is, which is to uphold a fantasy and obtain narcissistic supply through that fantasy. So we'll move now on to information control. So this is, as it sounds, any attempt to control access or the flow of information. So this can mean blocking access to certain sources of study. So in a cult setting, this would be certain texts, certain outside texts, and in extreme cases, it might even be like access to certain websites, like if they're living in a cult-controlled area, compound. This can include withholding information or cunningly managing its dissemination. So what often happens with narcissists is they can't tell the difference between genuine growth and transformation and merely getting other people to do what they want, right? So they actually confuse the result of getting what they want, getting supply, for genuine progress and coming to consciousness. So there's no actual transformation going on, there's merely adaptation. In their mind, it's like, if I cunningly manage the dissemination of information and I triangulate and talk to certain people through others, and I try and get other people to feed them a message without that person knowing, and I try and make it look like really clever and serendipitous, but actually I'm sort of pulling strings behind the scenes. In their mind, they think that's skillful, but really that's just manipulative, right? It's actually not respecting other people's sovereignty, and it's not presenting an accurate picture of reality to these people. It's deliberately trying to convey a different image of reality to the one that's actually occurring. And there's never a time that obfuscating reality is conducive to spiritual growth. Another form of information control is the misinterpretation of information, whether it's scriptural sources, or it could be something simple. It could just be like information about that person's life, like things that are coming back at them, feedback that's coming back to them, right? They're likely to misinterpret that in line with the fantasy that they're very attached to, this self-image. If it doesn't meet their self-image, it must be wrong, right? Or they must interpret it in a way that actually supports that self-image. So you sometimes see this with misinterpretation of ancient scripture. So there might be, say, certain people mentioned in the scripture, and there might be certain instances that are predicted. They might be done in a way that's kind of vague and ambiguous. And what a cult leader might do is they might interpret that very vague and ambiguous scripture in a way that is highly specific, spurious, and supportive of their fantasy and their role in the world. As an example, all ancient scripture is ambiguous, right? It's all highly symbolic. It's all massively lost in translation as well as being symbolic. It really is almost pure myth, right? And I think that's often how it was intended as well. But myth isn't very useful to a manipulator because they are kind of averse to the idea of an unconscious mind, at least in themselves. Like they might have some idea that other people have unconscious fears and desires, and they might abuse those fears and desires consciously or unconsciously. But in themselves, it's like, no, I'm enlightened, right? I understand. There's nothing I need to work on. So any idea of there being myth or something that speaks to the unconscious mind is kind of not really that compatible with their entire worldview. Like the idea that they have anything to explore in their own unconscious mind is quite unpalatable with their perfect self-image. Of course, lying, but I would also add to this any form of deception, right? And sometimes the ego tries to find a little out here, right? So it's like, maybe I didn't outright lie. It's kind of like the other person's responsibility for doing with that what they will, right? But really, if there's even been any kind of deception, whether it's a lie of omission as opposed to a lie of commission, or if it's any kind of minimization or maximization or spin or any attempt to convey an inaccurate picture of reality or to hold two views simultaneously, that's going to create conflict in the mind. Like it's the clues in the name, right? It's like conflict, yeah, holding two things simultaneously. And you could argue there's no easier way to create conflict in the mind than to lie or be in any way dishonest. That includes misdirection. Misdirection being where, rather than engaging with an issue head on, you sort of try and distract away from it, sort of try and tell an alternative narrative, or try and downplay the real issue or the real intention. For a story to be compelling, it can't merely sidestep concerns that have been raised against it. It has to actually explain and include those concerns. Gaslighting, I talked about this also in the previous episode, including the technique of DARVO, which stands for deny, accuse, reverse roles of victim and offender, and also project and defend. So whilst often psychological control can appear to be sophisticated, sometimes often not, but sometimes it can have that appearance, not because it is sophisticated, but because on some level we are not willing to see it for what it is. So, this is really a theme of any control dynamic, is that there's usually something in the person being controlled that they don't want to see what's really going on. It'd be too painful for them to see it at this time. And so actually freeing ourselves from control largely involves coming to see what we don't want to see. And as we do that, we realize that the MO of psychological abusers is actually pretty simple, right? It's really not that sophisticated. And a large part of it is just simply project and defend, right? Just accuse other people of doing what you yourself are doing, and just defend. Just don't allow those painful feelings to come to the surface no matter what. And so even when a person raises really fair and compelling evidence against an abuser, they're likely to just, in a very facile way, just kind of ignore that or pretend that it wasn't part of it, and actually just pretty much just affirm everything that their critics are saying. Another form of information control is to use fake identities and pseudonyms, either to impart or to receive information. So rather than actually face the issue head on, again, they have to sort of try and hide behind a story, a game of make-believe. As I said earlier, all other forms of deception, it's all deception after all forms of spying or secretly monitoring people in any way, whether it's through their computer use or visually spying on them, this is all information control. And what some cults will do actually is they will use information gathered in a covert way to then actually create compelling situations for the person they're trying to control. So for example, like Steve Hassan talks about this in his book as well, and that's there may be a trusted buddy of the person they're trying to bring on board, or like a recruiter, for example, who might get close to the target and then get certain information about them, their goals, their dreams, their histories, their struggles. And then a situation may be engineered where a sort of coincidence is created, and this other person who happens to be in the cult as well just happens to appear and just say the right thing at the right time to make that target person believe that joining and going along with this cult's mission, as it were, is a good idea for them. I've also written here, compartmentalizing into insider versus outsider, or us and them beliefs and doctrines. And again, this can be overt or it can be very subtle. So even if they're not actively denigrating other people or other groups, really the way things are structured is in such a way that they do kind of think that other people don't get it, right? Or that maybe if they're trying to present an image of holiness and transcendence, they're not going to put other religions or other groups down, but they will make out that their path is inclusive of all of them, right? It sort of transcends and includes all the religions prior to it. Now, we've all got to transcend and include our opposites of character, right? As we grow and develop. But that's different than transcending and including ideology into a new ideology that is literal and not mythical and throws out the unconscious and again claims to be absolute. Right? The only absolute truth is what you can experience yourself. There is no comprehensive left brain solution to the challenges presented on the path of growth. Moving now into thought control. So I just touched on this one, claiming to be the bearer of the absolute truth. This is actually a contradiction in terms, because no one can impart truth to you. There is only your experience and all the various inferences and deductions that you make about that. But actually, no book and no teacher can contain the truth. All they can do is point to it. All they can do is help guide you to discover it yourself. And so, on a similar tip, requiring that you internalize the doctrine as the truth. So whether it's the cult doctrine, the religious doctrine, or whether it's on a relationship level, whereby this person is saying that they are always right or they are always true, or in any way insinuating that, and mistaking, again, the symbol of reality and the symbol of the truth for the absolute truth. Instilling their map of reality and confusing it for the territory. So just because a certain set of rules has improved one situation, just because a certain way of life or a certain way of being has produced good results, doesn't mean that it's reality itself, doesn't mean that it is the truth. It can at best represent the truth or be a symbol of truth. Likewise, dictating what is good or bad. This is particularly insidious in organizational contexts, when most organizations, whether they're corporate organizations or religious or any kind of cult, any kind of exploitative group, they tend to have a view of what is good and bad. And I prefer to use the words wholesome and unwholesome, because I think they can be objectified. Good and bad are subjective, and they really only exist as a snapshot of the wider reality, right? But wholesome and unwholesome can be considered as conducive to wholeness or conducive to spiritual growth, and unconducive to spiritual growth or conducive to egotism, separation. Now, I would not say that unwholesome behavior is necessarily bad, right? From a certain perspective, of course it's bad. Of course it's painful, it's harmful, it produces suffering. But I would not even say that suffering is bad. The experience of suffering is painful, but suffering can actually also lead to growth, right? It can also show us what we couldn't see before. So good and bad are really just egoic concepts that the ego uses to try and navigate and make sense of reality. However, I do find there is utility in the concepts of, being wholesome and unwholesome. This also helps us move away from judgment. But if any organization, including workplaces, including exploitative cults, is really driving home what is good and what is bad, especially in an absolute sense, then it suggests they're not interested in the wider reality, or they haven't glimpsed it, right? And they are therefore interested in separation. Even though they might claim otherwise, they might say all the right things all the right ways, really they're still chopping reality up into an us and them kind of dynamic. Another form of thought control, discouragement of rational thought and constructive criticism. So if all I just said about conceptualizing and how that can be problematic, there still is use in rational thought. And so if rational thought and science and scientific thinking is being discouraged, then that would be a warning sign. The challenge here is that rational thought is a tool to be used in conjunction with other tools and other aspects of our consciousness. It's not that we should rely on it entirely or throw it out entirely, but that we would do well to find the middle way and find the right application of rational thought in conjunction with irrational experience. So if any person or group is discouraging nuanced, precise thinking, telling you to only remain in the present moment, right, and don't use any thought and don't trust any science, then they're not finding the middle way. They're not seeing the whole there. But at the same time, if they're purporting that rational thought is all you need and that science in its current form can answer everything, then that also is not the middle way. They're really, if anything, only looking at one half of reality. Another kind of thought control is erroneously redefining concepts in support of an agenda. So if you take existing words with established definitions and then try to expand or reduce or change them in some way, you actually then control people's thoughts and their emotions through erroneously redefining these concepts. Thought stopping techniques. This can be done in meditation. This can also be done in daily life, right? Cutting off painful thoughts. Forget about making them conscious, right? Just cut them off and hope they go away. Of course, true reality and the way the mind works isn't like that. Now, if you cut something off without actually making it conscious, then that's called repression, right? So it's just going to come back at some point. Denial, justification, rationalization, right? These are all expedient techniques for pushing away what we don't want to go near. Right? They don't actually solve the problem, just like the last point. We may think and hope that they work, but ultimately the only reason we'd ever need to do anything like this, to use any kind of thought stopping or rationalization, is because there's something we don't want to go near. There's a feeling we don't want to go near. And, as I've said, exploitative situations and exploitative people generally don't welcome an understanding of the unconscious mind. They'd rather push it away and rather wrangle with the world to try and please them. But actually, the only way out of that is to actually make the unconscious conscious. And lastly here, loaded and cliched language. And Steve Hassan talks about this and describes how this can actually shut down critical thought. Buddhists talk often about the concept of impermanence, right? But this has quite a specific meaning, and yet it's often used in a very cliched, broad brush way that isn't actually about impermanence at all. It's just a pleasing word for people to lean on as a way to remedy their feelings, as opposed to genuine understanding. So this loaded and cliched language just flung about like confetti, right? Trying to sort of just make ourselves feel better. This doesn't actually produce understanding unless it's actually dissected and understood and experienced. So moving now into emotional control techniques. This is any attempt to manipulate the feelings you experience, both painful and pleasant, because you can be manipulated through both of those things. Because naturally we want to push away painful feelings, and we want to go after pleasant feelings, right? This is the ego's way of trying to point us in the direction of growth. But of course, the ego and the self find it quite hard to communicate much of the time, because the ego is very rigid and logical, left-brained, and likes to patch up the world in easily sort of measurable chunks, whereas the self and the wider reality isn't really like that. It can only communicate in a symbolic way, and therefore it's possible for the ego to become confused by what merely looks like what is needed. And therefore, it is possible to be manipulated through those feelings, right? There is an unconscious that's involved, and it's making decisions on our behalf. And if there's painful feelings that the ego is trying to avoid that are contained in the unconscious, then we'll find ourselves taking actions that sort of try and avoid those things without us necessarily even realizing it. And a particularly insidious one here is trying to suggest that all the emotions you experience are caused by you. Okay, this is really spurious. Now, on some level, there's truth in this. That's the thing. It is true that our mind is bringing this about, and that these situations are arising because we need them to, right? We need to go through them. We need to navigate them in a skillful way so that we can evolve. But one ought to be a little suspicious when someone jumps on that fact, rubs their hands with glee, and says, therefore, everything you experience is caused by you, and is quite joyful at the fact that they can apparently therefore do anything and not be held accountable for it. That is completely fallacious. And also, what do we mean by you? Are we talking about the ego? right? Because the ego isn't choosing this pain, right? No one is consciously moving towards pain. If they're moving towards pain, then there's clearly some unconscious influence on their decision making. So it's highly spurious, and if anyone is suggesting this to be the case and using it as a way to control and render you as believing that any attempt to manipulate or abuse you is therefore justified, then this is a person who isn't seeing outside their own ego, right? Because they're still talking in terms of you, right? They're still saying you are responsible for the emotions, and that's not a nuanced understanding of how the mind actually operates. So highly likely this is not someone who is actually pursuing genuine spiritual growth, right? The ego is too much in control, and the higher self is firmly quashed and placated in its attempts to get the ego to wake up. Emotional repression techniques, again, so conveying the idea that emotions are bad or painful emotions are bad, or that if you have painful emotions, then this is somehow bad and that you shouldn't have them. Like if you're enlightened, then you shouldn't be experiencing these emotions. Well, of course, the logical choice by anyone hearing that is to push those emotions away, or to pretend they don't have those emotions, or to hide those emotions. And that is highly inconducive to spiritual growth, because that would require us to make those emotions conscious. If we're just pushing them away, that's just repression, and we're not gaining freedom through that process. Those emotions will be buried in the unconscious, where they then continue to exert control over our decisions without us necessarily realizing it, and that's not the path to freedom, clearly. So likewise, claiming that any emotions are bad or wrong or unholy or unwholesome or otherwise indicative of spiritual or psychological immaturity. These emotions all exist for a reason. They're all natural. They all serve a purpose. There's no such thing as a bad emotion. You could argue there's no such thing as a good emotion. There may be pleasant and painful emotions, but they all exist for a useful reason. And if we can follow those emotions to where they're truly pointing us, rather than grasp at egoic short-term answers, expedient solutions, then our emotions are the key that unlocks the door. They will lead us in the direction of spiritual growth. Another emotional control technique is hoovering. So this is a technique employed by narcissists where even after the relationship has ended, they will try to get back in contact or try and get back on your radar somehow. This is an attempt at emotional control because it's trying to reel you back in. And if anything, it's actually just trying to provide temporary relief for this person because they're suffering from that lack of narcissistic supply. Another form of emotional control, instilling fears of any kind. Fear of anger, violence, abandonment, hell, incalculable rebirths, accidents, reincarnation as an animal or a ghost. The great irony here, of course, is that it's the ego that experiences fear, and it's the ego that wants to remain in the situation as a way to placate the fear. So it is necessarily true that anyone who is trying to instill fears of any kind is not acting in our best interests. That is not the way to create conditions for someone to grow and develop spiritually. Pointing out spiritual attainments or your position on any kind of map of progress or incentives for growth. Right, spiritual growth is its own incentive. Genuine spiritual growth doesn't need any additional or artificial appearances of an incentive to move along it. And a lot of these traditions are just flooded with ideas of levels, stages of enlightenment, or the jhanas, or degrees of masonry, or whatever it is. These maps are just maps. They're not the territory. And it's very unusual to see someone using a map and not confuse it for the territory. Rather than your practice and your experience being reflected in the map, the reverse is employed. So in other words, they say, oh, you're experiencing this because you're at this stage or you're at this position on the map. And I'm not saying maps can't be useful. I consider spiral dynamics to be very useful, and that's a kind of map. But these things have to be used very carefully, and almost invariably they are taught and put forward without any due care as to how they might be used. So, the vast majority of the time, maps of progress are not only not useful, but also highly inaccurate, highly incompatible with other maps of progress. So, figure that out. And not least, antithetical to genuine progress. So, a bit of a concern if there's any use of attainments or maps of progress as incentives. All kinds of measuring, comparing, or grading. Right? Giving people marks out of 10, giving people percentages. This is something people sometimes do when they're talking about the sexual attractiveness of another person. They give them marks out of 10. And this is potentially a form of emotional control. Like if you say that to the person, if you say like, yeah, I think, you're more attractive than like 40% of people here. It's like, what does that mean? Okay. And what do I do about that? And why does that matter? Right. So that's certainly possible as a form of emotional control. Another one here is no legitimate reason to leave. So you're damned if you do, you're damned if you don't. Now, life isn't like that. There is always a way forward. If anyone's ever trying to suggest to you that there is no way forward other than the one they have laid out to you, that's highly inaccurate. They are trying to do that for their own benefit. There is no situation in life where there is any way forward other than the one that makes the unconscious conscious. Right, I'll put that on the line. And so I've added here a concept of my own called Schrodinger's con man. So this is where a psychological manipulator essentially tries to be in two places at once. And this is quite easy for a narcissist or an abuser to do because they are inherently split in themselves. They have a very conflicted psyche. And, I genuinely think that much of the time they don't even realize they're doing it, right? It's their ego rendering reality to them the only way it knows how, and doing it in a way that doesn't go near the unresolved issues and the unresolved feelings that they're having to placate. So as a result of this, they often contradict themselves and will try and present two simultaneous appearances of reality and put you in a double bind, essentially. So if ever there are double standards being applied selectively and an unwillingness to let you know which of two or more options is the one they're really doing or the reason they're really doing something, then that would be suggestive of a lack of empathy. And I don't know about you, but I prefer to hang out with people who do show empathy. Tends to make life better, I find. Now, just to recap something I said in the episode about cults, and that was what the cults of tomorrow are likely to be like, because it's one thing looking at all these techniques of control, understanding what they look like, but they're going to take new forms, right? And as long as there is an unwillingness in oneself to actually see what's really going on here, then the actual control techniques don't need to be that sophisticated. The mind will find a way to filter out what's really going on. And so as a lot of cults are moving online now, a lot of the control is about thought and emotional control. It becomes a little bit less about behavioral control, and certainly physical control becomes much less important to the cult. But if there is a compelling thought and emotional control narrative, it doesn't really matter because you can control someone's behavior through the narrative. So I think we're going to see more use of dark psychology, gaslighting, misdirection, deception, emotional control and fear, and it's likely to be employed more discreetly, slowly and carefully over long periods of time. Because tactics change over time, and just as all people are learning from the stories of yesterday, the news, right, and the cults and the horror stories and the really overt tragedies like Jonestown, for example, well, so are abusers, right? So are cult leaders. They are learning from this stuff too. And rather than transforming and facing up to the genuine and legitimate criticism raised against them, they're merely adapting, sidestepping, maneuvering, going around it and trying to minimize and downplay certain things and push other things away from public knowledge. And that's no surprise, of course. That is entirely predictable, and it's because they've set their stall out to uphold that fantasy and that self-image for as long as they live. So we need not be surprised by that. We just need to be aware that there's a progression going on of adaptation to the modern age. And I describe many of these new techniques as subtle and covert tactics. I think these are going to become more and more common. Clearly, this has always been the case, right? Psychological control has always been subtle and it's always been covert. And I think it's just the emphasis is moving ever more in that direction. That said, there's been great use of behavioural control these last couple of years. I won't say much more about it than that. But there is always an accompanying emotional and thought control narrative, and not to mention an informational control strategy as well. So I think there's really three reasons for this. Firstly, people becoming more aware of the real life horror stories of actual events. Secondly, of physical force becoming less viable and less common, considered more and more crude over time. 1,000 years ago, it would seem like people thought less about using physical force, right? The kings and queens and so on, the local barons, right? Force was kind of the way that things were often done. But over time, we've come to think of violence as, rightly so, as being quite crude. So it's becoming less socially workable to employ physical force. And there's a third factor here, and that is that influence is moving online. This can be in the form of a digital cult where, there's no physical force involved, but there might be certainly informational and emotional, and they may be doing harm in other ways. They may be doing harm financially, legally, spiritually. So this is why it pays to understand what undue influence is, and not merely these various examples of what it might look like. So I'm going to relay a few examples, having said that, but I hope that as I do this, it's really trying to get you to work with, okay, what's underpinning all of this? Like, what are the other ways in which this can show up? These are a few examples that I have seen personally, but they can and will show up in any kind of form. So the first would be claiming that because a person or group does not do this kind of undue influence or that kind of undue influence, they must therefore not be doing any kind of undue influence and are therefore not an abuser or are therefore not a cult. Now, it doesn't take a PhD in logic to realize why that is flawed, right? So cults will often do this. They'll say things like, well, because we're not forcing anybody, everyone's making their own decisions, right? Therefore, we must not be lying or deceiving or making spurious claims or misinterpreting scripture or trying to get other people to project their inner numinous content onto oneself, onto the leader. And if that's occurring, that is exploitation, hands down. It doesn't matter if there's no sexual abuse going on. It doesn't matter if people aren't being asked to sign over their life savings. That might be happening, I don't know. But the point is that just because you don't force someone doesn't mean that you aren't doing other things that aren't unethical. So this is a great example of how even some just ridiculous, spurious logic like this can actually be enough to temporarily objection handle someone who's conflicted and on the fence. So, oh, okay, that sounds nice. Yeah, it just placates the feeling in the short term if there's an unwillingness to see what's really going on. As I've touched on, claiming that everything that happens to you is your responsibility, your choices, etc. Right, that's highly spurious at best. Even though I'll be the first to say that we ought to take responsibility for our mind, and that is key to any resolution to any situation like this, and of course to our own spiritual growth. It might be worth just emphasizing here actually that there is always a place for compassion. I want to make it really clear that I'm not advocating any kind of just demonization of anyone who has trespassed against you in the past, right? It's not about that. That's not in line with how things really are, right? That's the mind trying to make them seem a certain way, to fix them a certain way, and to resolve the issue through that judgment. But in reality, they appeared for a reason. There was a lesson in the experience, and in order to really resolve the situation, not just now, but into the future, so that it doesn't reoccur in some new and idiosyncratic way, it's necessary to make the unconscious conscious in yourself. So this is not about demonizing anyone. This is not about just pushing people away, even though it may well involve ending relationships. But that's different from pushing them away in your mind and not wanting to go near whatever the issue was that gave rise to it in the first place. So some more subtle tactics here. Making allusions to someone's position or their role or their attainments or their position in the world. So it's one thing to come out and say it. It's another thing to hint at it or imply it in any way. And really, the latter is no more noble than the former. If anything, it's just more tricky. It's just more slippery. It's just more attempts to not resolve one's actual conflict, but merely to placate it. Likewise, dropping any physical hints as to the same. So, for example, by adopting the signature pose of a particular religious figure, or drawing spurious links between texts and their own lives. So saying things like, well, the Buddha had one son and I've got one son. Coincidence? Well, it's like, there could be 1,000 qualities that this religious figure had, and maybe you happen to share 50 of them, and it could be any 50, but just because you share those particular 50, what about the other 950, right? So this is very sort of spurious logic, and it's actually another way of trying to convince the conscious mind of anyone who is conflicted and under their control or their influence that this is the real deal. This is actually something they want to get involved in. And curiously, I've actually seen 2 different Jesus claimants in the 21st century adopting the signature pose of the Maitreya Buddha. So if you Google Maitreya Buddha and you look at the statues of this prophesied future Buddha, he's sitting in a certain pose, and I've seen 2 separate Jesus claimants alive today sit in that same pose. So there's clearly something going on here, and there's people who would quite like us to believe that they were this new Buddha, and anyone can sit that way, right? It doesn't mean anything. Okay, so another covert tactic would be to offer preemptive stock material designed to handle many of the common objections to their grandiosity. And this is coupled with critiques being merely sidestepped with alternate narratives. So not addressed head on, not actually engaged with. So if someone blows the whistle, he says, this person isn't what they claim to be, rather than actually engage with the evidence, they sort of just, let's just step away from that. Let's just bury that. Let's provide this alternative narrative. And for someone to truly be convinced, it's not sufficient to merely provide an alternative. You actually have to engage with the facts that are being presented. So it's a red flag if someone is merely sidestepping. Another tactic here, ostentatious humility and exhibitionist displays of respect, honor, renunciation, charity. If someone seems to care a lot that other people perceive them as humble or respectful, or that they are doing all the right things to renounce worldly desire, or are being very charitable, then this is someone who hasn't let go of their self-image. This is someone with a very pronounced persona-shadow dynamic. And one example of this I remember was at a conference I was at once. I won't name any names, but there was a couple of speakers at this event, and one of them was selling his real estate course and made sure to drop many times about all the charities he was donating money to. And at the end of his talk, he said, there's a condition to signing up to my course, and that is that you donate. I think it was £2,000 or £3,000. I forget the exact amount. You donate £2,000 or £3,000 to a charity when you make your first £100,000. I mean, it's almost so flagrant to be unbelievable that works, right? It's so clearly an attempt to appear charitable, and if someone's trying to appear charitable, then highly likely they're actually not charitable at all in their spirit, right? They're just trying to present an image of it so they don't have to actually go near the real thing, so they can actually just get the result they really want. And that was actually the moment where I decided to not come in for day 2. I just thought, this is not for my benefit, right? And partnering with someone like that is doomed to failure. And thankfully, I had already learned my lesson by that point. So any attempt to remove you from your center, any attempt to get you to project anything onto them, any lack of respect for your own self-sovereignty, your own free choice, your own right to progress spiritually. And so this includes gaslighting, right? This is trying to deny your reality, trying to spin things, trying to make out that you don't understand when actually you know full well that you do understand. So this is all attempts to remove you from your center, to destabilize you psychologically, so that you then project your sovereignty onto someone else. So you then start to think that they are the point. Inconsistency, rapid and erratic changes of tack, changing accounts of events, shaky details, and a lack of nuance. So I touched on this in the last episode, and it's that mistakes are made all the time by people employing these tactics, right? There is always an inconsistency, there's always a lack of nuance, there's often very shaky details. And even if it's about something that seems quite innocuous, if there is a difficulty remembering details, like sometimes that can just be a harmless personality quirk, but sometimes it can actually be because there's a lot of psychological conflict. And so you might hear someone recounting an event and they might repeat it many times, and it's a little bit different each time, but in like quite a serious way, right? So they might say things like, yeah, I used to run my own business and I was once offered $1 million for that business. And the next time they tell it, they might say, yeah, I used to run a business and it used to bring in about $1 million a year in revenue. And then the next time they tell it, they might say, yeah, I used to have a business and it used to produce $1 million a year in profit. And hopefully by the third iteration, you're thinking, hang on a second, there's some really shaky details here. I'm wondering, well, why is it important that this person tells me so much about their business? Like, what are they getting out of this? And why can't they remember the details? And it may well be because the details are serving the fantasy, right? Not the other way around. So this is very common amongst manipulators, is that the fantasy comes first. The end comes first. And the story has to morph and change around that image that they're attaching to. So I'm going to bring this to an end now, and I want to bring it full circle and just end by saying the most insidious form of control is that which looks and feels like freedom. So of all the different strategies and tactics of mind control that we have covered here today, often they will be done in a particularly insidious way, and it will be portrayed as though they are somehow beneficial or for your own good. Now, I want to relay this back to something I said at the very start, which was that if there's ever an attempt to persuade you in a way that they wouldn't be doing if they were acting out of empathy, then that is unethical. If any of this stuff is being done as a way to avoid their own need to transform, their own need to interface with you and the rest of the world and transform through that interaction, then it's not in your interests. And you do very well to see that for what it is and understand the existence of this phenomena in our world, and not just see it as something bad and negative, but actually it does kind of play a vital role, but it is, for want of a better word, defined as evil, right? So if there's any attempt to convince you that their unwillingness to transform is for your benefit, Well, that's just because that's convenient for them in their own hopeless pursuit of avoiding consciousness. So see that for what it is. And even though we do make our own decisions, even though we are responsible for our own mind, there is nonetheless the role of evil in that process. And we would do well to understand that exists and not be complicit in its arising. So I'm going to leave that there, guys. I hope that was useful, and I shall chat to you next time.